I thought I had everything I needed: the tent, sleeping bag, cooler of food, and an array of bug spray and sunscreen. My friends Jack and Megan agreed to join me on a camping trip in the remote wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains. It was supposed to be a fun, thrilling adventure before we all headed off to college in the fall. We arrived at the campsite just before sunset and quickly set up our tents near the edge of a calm lake. The peaceful sounds of nature surrounded us as we built a fire and started grilling hamburgers for dinner. But as the sky grew darker, our surroundings became more eerie. The once calming sounds turned into eerie whispers and rustling noises in the woods surrounding our campsite. We awkwardly laughed it off as our imaginations and dread of the unknown. We continued to drink and chat until it was well past midnight. By then, fatigue began to settle in, and everyone except for Jack had crawled into their tent. Jack said he still wanted to roast marshmallows, and Megan and I went to bed. I soon fell fast asleep, the sound of Jack munching on s'mores the last thing I remembered. I awoke in the early hours of the morning to the horrific sounds of Jack screaming outside our tent. My heart pounding, I quickly unzipped the entrance and stepped outside to see Jack frantically stumbling towards the tent site covered in blood. Terror and disbelief greeted me as I took in the grisly scene. Jack was missing half his face, and there was a gnawed-out cavity where his left eye should have been. My body convulsed in my own vomit seeing Jack brought back to our campsite. Megan, frozen with fear, let out a blood-curdling scream before collapsing to her knees, the scattered debris of Jack's face causing her to suffer from an onset of shock. We attempted to run, tripping over each other in the darkened panic. Megan made it to a ranger station a few miles away and returned with help. I've been traumatized ever since, replaying the disfigured face of Jack over and over in my head. I still have no idea what really happened that night or what attacked him, but I'm certain that something sinister lives in the woods. My camping trip with Jack and Megan ended in a way that I would never have imagined. After Jack was attacked, the authorities conducted a search of the surrounding woods but found nothing. No signs of any animal that could have inflicted such injuries. No empty cages from a nearby wildlife park, or even any evidence of other campers nearby. 6 months later, I was heading out of town and stopped at a gas station. As I was filling my car with gas, I overheard 2 guys from out of town talking about a similar incident that happened to a group of campers. Their campsite was found completely destroyed, camping gear, bags, and food strewn about. One of the campers was found with a torn throat and half-missing face. The other 2 were never found. It was then that I realized that what happened to us in the woods that night was not unique. There was something seriously wrong with those woods, and it wasn't something any of us should have messed with. It was an uneasy feeling that stayed with me and would go with me everywhere I went. I often think back to that night, wondering what it was that could have caused Jack's gruesome injuries. Was it a bear, a pack of wolves, or something much more sinister? The truth is, I'll never know. But one thing is for certain. I'll never go camping again or venture into those woods alone. It's been years since that camping trip, but I can still hear Jack's screams, and his gruesome face haunts me every day. I've come to accept that there are some things in this world that are better left untouched, and those woods were one of them. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway with a group of friends. We had been planning this camping trip for months, and I was really looking forward to spending some time in nature, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. With everything packed and ready to go, we hit the road early that Friday morning, excitement building with each mile we covered. As we drove further and further into the wilderness, the trees grew taller and the dirt roads became bumpier. I could feel my heart racing with both exhilaration and fear. We arrived at the campsite just before dark, tired from the long drive, but eager to set up camp and start our adventure. We loaded our tents and supplies onto our backs and made our way through the dense woods. We found a spot to set up camp, and as we worked to pitch our tents, we realized how thick the forest was around us. We were truly in the middle of nowhere, and that realization sent chills down my spine. The first night was relatively uneventful. We sat around the campfire telling stories and laughing, feeling the warmth and glow of the flames as a chill settled in. But as the night wore on, a strange sense of unease descended upon us. The woods were unnaturally still, and the sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal noises were replaced with a deafening silence. As we all settled into our tents, I could feel my heart pounding. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that it was just nerves and that everything would be okay. But then I heard it, a low growl outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat, and I sat paralyzed with fear. The growl grew louder and more menacing, and I could feel my tent trembling. I knew I needed to do something, but fear had me in its grip. Finally, finding the courage to act, I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent. As I stepped out into the dark, I felt a wave of terror wash over me. The forest around us had fallen silent, and I was standing there, alone and defenseless in the middle of a danger zone. To be continued. I shone my flashlight through the trees, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. 2 shining red eyes, watching me from the cover of the trees, unblinking and unwavering. I took a step back, my heart racing as I realized that I was not alone out here. Whatever was watching me was not human, and definitely not something I wanted to mess with. I made the decision to wake up my friends and tell them what I saw. As I made my way to their tents, I could hear them rustling inside, as if they too were aware of the danger around us. We gathered around the fire, huddled together for warmth and safety, as we tried to make sense of what was going on. But the eerie silence enveloped us once again, as if whatever was out there was listening in on our every word. It wasn't until dawn broke that we finally dared to venture out of our campsite, scanning the area for any sign of our stalker, but to no avail. It was as if it had vanished into thin air without leaving any trace behind. We picked up our bags and quickly made our way back to the car, the sound of the engine roaring to life signaling the end of our nightmare. As I looked back into the dense undergrowth one last time, a cold shudder ran down my spine. Whatever was out there, it was not alone, and it was definitely not friendly. As we drove home, silence filled the car, as if our experience was too much to bear. I knew that I would never forget that camping trip, and it would be a long time before I set foot in the wilderness again. That camping trip was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway, but it ended up becoming a harrowing experience that left us all shaken and forever changed. I never really considered myself someone who enjoyed the great outdoors. I was never fond of bugs or dirt, but when my group of friends proposed a camping trip to the remote wilderness deep in the mountains, I reluctantly agreed to go along with it. The plan was simple. We would spend the weekend camping in the middle of nowhere, taking in the beauty of nature and enjoying each other's company. It all sounded perfect until we arrived at the campsite, which was far more remote than I had anticipated. The wilderness was darker than I could have ever imagined. The trees were so thick that the sunlight barely penetrated the forest canopy, and the air felt incredibly still. It was almost as if we were alone in the vastness of the forest. We quickly set up our tents and started a fire. As darkness crept in, we drank and chatted around the flickering flames, but the night felt overbearing. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. Something was watching us. Just before midnight, we all retreated to our tents to get some much-needed rest. But as I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds of the forest around me, I realized I wasn't alone. I could hear something moving outside my tent, crunching leaves and snapping branches, circling our campsite. At first, I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the sounds were too deliberate and loud to be anything natural. My hands shook as I reached for the flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on, making the darkness even more suffocating. The noise outside got closer, and I could see the shadow of someone passing by the entrance of my tent. My heart raced as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Who could possibly be out here in the middle of nowhere? But my questions were answered moments later, as a hand reached through the entrance of my tent, groping the air beside me. I screamed, and it was soon followed by the screams from my friends, who were faced with the same terrifying situation. That was just the beginning of our nightmare. as we all fought to survive the horrors that lurked in the darkness outside our tents. As we huddled together in terror, we could hear the footsteps of multiple people circling around our campsite. There was no question about it. We were under attack. In desperation, we tried to fight back, but our assailants were too many, too strong, too organized. The next thing I knew, I was hit on the head from behind, and everything went black. When I regained consciousness, I was tied up, unable to move or see anything beyond the cloth over my eyes. Muffled screams and sobs echoed into my ears, telling me my friends were in a similar situation. We were held captive for days, unsure of what our abductors intended to do with us. I couldn't shake the thought that we were trapped out in the middle of nowhere, with no help coming. Eventually, we were released without explanation, left to make our own way back to civilization. The trauma of the experience stayed with us long after we were finally safe at home. The investigation led to nothing. Nobody could explain who they were or why they had tortured us. The authorities' dismissal of the case left us with nowhere else to turn, and we were forced to take matters into our own hands. Determined to find out the truth, we returned to the wilderness, retracing our steps towards the nightmare that had haunted us for months. What we found was far more terrorizing than we could have ever imagined. The true culprit was nature at its worst. Making our way through the seemingly empty woods, we found an idyllic cabin cozy by a stream, footsteps away from where we had originally camped. But inside, we uncovered the horrifying extent of the cabin's occupancy. Drained human remains hung on the walls and were scattered all over the place. From then on, I never thought of camping the same way again. Traumatized for years and left with a fear of ever camping again, the psychological scars of my close encounter continue to haunt me.